Well, those action potentials that we've been talking about, they are traveling either toward the central nervous system or they are traveling away from the central nervous system. The central nervous system consists of the brain and the spinal cord. The brain and the spinal cord are one and the same tissue. So what you have is neurons, and you have all of those glial cells that kind of hold things together. If you reached inside a person's head and pulled the brain out, well, the spinal cord would come with it because they are continuous with each other. We differentiate between the two only by the location of the foramen magnum. So if it is north of the foramen magnum, we call it brain. If it's south of the foramen magnum, we call it the spinal cord. Both of these are surrounded by bone. We have looked in great detail at the bones of the cranium, and we have also looked at the bones of the vertebral column. Well, when we have nervous tissue, such as the brain and spinal cord, housed within bony tissue, some of which is very rough and sharp edged, which could damage the nervous tissue, then we have to have some protection. So we have cerebrospinal fluid. The brain effectively floats in that fluid inside the cranium, but we also have three layers of connective tissue between the bone and the nervous tissue itself. So I have shown here in these illustrations what we have to protect the brain and the spinal cord from the surrounding bone that it is housed within. So on the left, those are the meninges that surround the brain. They are continuous with the meninges that surround the spinal cord. So we have an outermost dura mater that is very thick and tough. It's actually two layers. The two layers of the dura mater are called the periosteal layer and the meningeal layer. Dura mater means tough mother. So it is there to protect the brain from those rough and sharp edges that are inside the cranium. You have seen those. The middle layer of the meninges is called the arachnoid. Arachnoid means like a spider. I think what they really meant to say is it is like a spider's web. Well, that's okay. The cerebrospinal fluid actually runs in and below the arachnoid. Directly against the surface of the brain, a thin layer of simple squamous epithelium, kind of like a very thin sheet of plastic sitting right on the surface of the brain. That is the pia mater. The pia means tender, so that is the tender mother. So these are the three layers of the meninges as they are positioned around the brain. Well, that continues right down through the vertebral column. So on the right, you can see how the meninges surround the spinal cord. So outermost there, the epidural space, that's where an injection is made, an anesthetic injection is made into the epidural fat when a woman is about to give birth to anesthetize the area south of where the shot was given. So we say the woman had an epidural. Well, that means a shot, an anesthetic shot, was injected into the epidural space, which is mostly fat. Fat is a cushion. So obviously we need as much cushioning as we can get when we have very fragile and non-replaceable nervous tissue in that same area. Okay, so the layout of the meninges is the same. We have the outermost dura mater, we have the middle arachnoid, and we have the pia mater positioned directly against the surface of the spinal cord. So I just wanted to acquaint you with the meninges before we delve into the internal structures of the spinal cord itself. Next. Okay, let me give a little bit of a setup before I talk about the spinal cord in particular. You may recall that I mentioned that we have things called receptors. Receptors are entities that will fire an action potential when they are stimulated by certain stimuli, such as the rods and cones of the retina of the eye being stimulated by light, the chemoreceptors of the taste buds and the nose or the olfactory cells, stimulated by the binding of certain chemical molecules, or the touch receptors of the skin, being stimulated by pressure or by hot and cold or by pain. Those are stimuli that will compel those receptors to fire an action potential. So these are senses. Therefore, they will travel in the sensory pathways. Sensory pathways are called afferent signals. Afferent signals are going toward the central nervous system. The central nervous system includes the brain and spinal cord. So these are signals that are picked up by receptors. The receptors fire an action potential. The action potential goes toward the spinal cord. So looking at this diagram here, I can tell you that that structure called the posterior root of the spinal nerve, I prefer to use the term dorsal. That's the way it was taught when I was in school. Dorsal means posterior. Posterior means dorsal. All the same, the labeling that was already there uses the word posterior. I use the word dorsal. They both mean the same thing. Back to what I was saying. Sensory signals travel from the receptor toward the central nervous system. They will enter into the spinal cord through the dorsal root. So recognize the posterior root of the spinal nerve there. Also recognize the enlarged area of that. That is called the dorsal root ganglion. So you're talking about a sensory pathway, incoming signals from the receptors to the spinal cord. So those are afferent or sensory signals following the afferent or sensory pathways. I like to say that sensory signals enter into the spinal cord through the back door. Well, that's what the posterior root is, through the back door. Okay, now let's go the opposite direction. What if we have motor signals? Motor signals travel from the central nervous system, the brain and spinal cord, toward their target tissue, which we call an effector. Effectors are skeletal muscle, smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, or glands. The only one of those that's under voluntary control are the skeletal muscles. So these are motor pathways. The action potential originates in the central nervous system and travels out of the spinal cord toward the effectors. Motor pathways exit the spinal cord by way of the front door. So here on this diagram, it's labeled anterior root. Well, that just means the ventral root. That's the word that I would use. The ventral roots carry motor signals. Motor signals are going from the central nervous system to the target organ or effectors. All right, notice also that the roots join to the spinal cord by rootlets. That's just an anatomical designation. Also notice that the two roots, the dorsal root and the ventral root, called here the posterior and anterior root, They come together. Where they come together, it's called the spinal nerve. The spinal nerve only runs for about an inch until it splits into two or bifurcates. And so I have labeled there on the left the dorsal ramus and the ventral ramus. Those are the two divisions of the spinal nerve. The spinal nerve is formed by the coming together of the roots. So the diagram there, I have added my own labels to the existing diagram so that you can see. We start with rootlets. They come together to form roots. The dorsal root has a ganglion, that is a sensory pathway. When the two roots come together, we form the spinal nerve. The spinal nerve runs only for about an inch, and then it splits into a dorsal ramus, which goes to the musculature and skin of the back, and a ventral ramus, which wraps around the front of the body. So there are 31 pairs of spinal nerves. So that's a total of 62. You've got 31 on the right, 31 on the left. So that is the anatomy of the spinal nerves as they come off of the spinal cord. Now, looking here at the cross section of the spinal cord, I guess the first thing that you would notice is that you have gray matter and you have white matter. The gray matter is in the central part. It's kind of butterfly shaped or shaped like the letter H. It is gray because that's where the neurons and their dendrites are. They are resident in the gray matter. Neurons and dendrites do not have myelin. Axons are myelinated. Myelin is white. So the axons that spring forth from the neurons travel in the white matter. So you have the gray matter there in the central part. You have the white matter, which is myelinated axons, out at the periphery. Okay, some other anatomical structures there or names of various areas. Let's just start there at the very top. There is a split between left and right. On the backside, that is called the posterior median sulcus. Just adjacent to that, we have what is otherwise called a column of white matter. Columns are also called funiculi. So in the white matter, on the backside, you have the posterior column or funiculus. Toward the side, you have the lateral column or funiculus. And out front, you have the anterior column or anterior funiculus of the white matter. Now look at the gray matter. It also has designated areas. So it has that butterfly type shape. So we have a posterior horn, a lateral horn, and an anterior horn. Those are areas of the gray matter. Where the gray matter crosses over from left to right, that is called the gray commissure. And the hole there in the middle of the gray commissure is the central canal of the spinal cord. That is filled with cerebrospinal fluid. So that is the anatomy, dividing the spinal cord up into columns or funiculi and dividing the gray matter up into posterior, lateral, and anterior horns. Remember that it is the gray matter that has the nerve cell bodies, the neurons themselves, plus their dendrites. They are non-myelinated, so it is gray. The white matter surrounding that, well, those are the myelinated axons of the spinal cord. The spinal cord itself begins at the foramen magnum. It is simply a continuation of the medulla oblongata. South of the foramen magnum, we simply call it the spinal cord. It is surrounded by the three layers of meninges, just like we had in the brain. You have the innermost pia mater, the middle arachnoid, and the outermost dura mater. Between the dura mater and the bone of the vertebral column, there is a layer of fat, which is called the epidural space. Now we descend from the foramen magnum to the level of L1, L2. So between the first lumbar vertebrae and the second lumbar vertebrae, the spinal cord itself comes to a point. That point is called the conus medullaris. Now, the spinal nerves that branch off of the spinal cord, they continue to descend in the vertebral column and ultimately will exit between the lumbar vertebrae and through the anterior and posterior sacral foramina. So since they look like a ponytail, those spinal nerves that travel down after the spinal cord has come to a point, they are called the cauda equina, which means the ponytail. The very last spinal nerve that comes straight down here is called the coccygeal nerve, and then the very final filament there, the filum terminale, is also called the coccygeal ligament because it anchors the spinal cord down. It holds it in place. It isn't nervous tissue, it's connective tissue. So we call it the filum terminale. The very last nerves to exit are the coccygeal nerves. North of that, you have the sacral nerves, then the lumbar nerves, the thoracic nerves, etc. So those are the anatomical areas of the spinal cord beginning at the foramen magnum. There is a cervical enlargement where a mass of spinal nerves comes off. There is also a lumbar enlargement where a mass of spinal nerves come off. Those are just larger or more dense areas of the spinal cord than other areas because more of the nerves will be emanating from those areas. Okay, I mentioned that sensory signals, afferent signals, those signals that are going from sensory receptors toward the spinal cord and then toward the brain. Those are called the ascending tracts because they are going up. They are sensory. They are going to the brain to be interpreted. So shown here in green are the ascending tracts, the sensory pathways. First of all, remember that sensory signals enter through the back door. So it's not labeled there, but you can find the dorsal root and the dorsal root ganglion. Those are the roots through which incoming sensory afferent signals enter into the spinal cord. Once they enter into the spinal cord, they travel up toward the brain by way of these ascending tracts or fasciculi. So notice there at the very back in the dorsal column of white matter, we have the fasciculus gracilis and the fasciculus cuneatus. The fasciculus gracilis transmits sensory signals, primarily signals of touch, in some cases signals of visceral pain. Below vertebrae level T6. The fasciculus cuneatus will transmit sensory signals, primarily touch, in some cases signals of visceral pain, from above vertebrae level T6. So both of these pathways are taking sensory information toward the brain. The fasciculus gracilis signals below T6, fasciculus cuneatus signals above T6. Both of those will come together in the medulla oblongata to form a structure that we will call the medial lemniscus. So for now, just remember that the gracile fasciculus and the cuneate fasciculus are located in the dorsal column of the spinal cord. So you say, well, why is that important? Well, what if you have surgery on your spinal cord and the surgeon cuts the wrong area? Well, we have to have the areas of the spinal cord mapped out so that such a mistake isn't made. We have to know where these signals are being transmitted in order to avoid damaging the wrong areas. So these are sensory signals, primarily sense of touch, traveling in the gracile and cuneate fasciculi. Over to the lateral aspect, we have the spinocerebellar tracts. These are sensory signals that are coming from muscles, tendons. We have receptors in our muscles and tendons to give to us a sense of balance. We have to be able to stand on 2 feet, and in order to do that, we have to have balance. Well, those signals are processed in the cerebellum. So these are signals that are coming from the skeletal muscles, from the bones, from the tendons to feed into the cerebellum so that we have an awareness of our position in space. Are we leaning forward? Are we leaning backwards? Are we upside down or are we right side up? Well, those are proprioceptive signals, and the cerebellum coordinates those so that we can coordinate our responses to them to avoid falling down. All right, moving anteriorly from there, also shown in green, these are the sensory pathways, they're shown in green. You have the lateral spinothalamic tract and the ventral spinothalamic tract. Those are 2 of the primary pain pathways. We do have another pain pathway, and it isn't shown here, and I'm not sure why. It would be called the spino-reticular tract. Those are pain pathways. So we have signals of pain coming from the receptors. They will enter into the spinal cord by way of the dorsal root. Remember, sensory signals enter by the back door. They travel up the spinal cord in these spinothalamic and also spinoreticular tracts. Over on the right side, we have labeled the red neighborhoods. Well, red indicates here the motor pathways. So green, those are sensory or afferent signals. Red indicates coming from the central nervous system, the brain and spinal cord, to the target tissues, such as skeletal muscle, smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, glands. So we have the descending tracts or the descending pathways going down the spinal cord. All right, so there we have the lateral corticospinal tract. In a previous PowerPoint, I showed to you an area of the brain that we called the motor cortex. And within the motor cortex, I showed you a strip of myelinated white matter that we called the internal capsule. The lateral corticospinal tract contains the same fibers that originated in the motor cortex. So this is our primary notion to make a motion going down the spinal cord. So they will travel in both the lateral corticospinal tract and the anterior corticospinal tract, which I don't see that labeled here. Oh, there it is. It's called ventral. So now we shift to the word ventral. That's great. So we have lateral and ventral corticospinal tracts. Those will ultimately innervate the skeletal muscles, and consequently, we have our voluntary movement. Other red areas shown here, forget the rubrospinal tract. There is no such thing as a rubrospinal tract in humans. It was once theorized that since other animals have a rubrospinal tract, that humans must have also. Well, that has been found to not be true. Humans don't even have a rubrospinal tract. What might have been rubrospinal has been fully incorporated into the corticospinal tracts in humans. All right, other areas there shown in red, the reticulospinal tract. The medulla, the pons, and the midbrain have an area called the reticular formation. There are many functions that go with the reticular formation. One of them has to do with maintaining balance and coordinating skeletal muscle contraction to maintain our posture in space. So the reticulospinal tracts, as they descend the spinal cord, are about that business. Later, when we get to the reticular formation, which is located in the brain stem, I will talk about several other functions that originate in the reticular formation. In this case, we're only talking about coordination of skeletal muscle contraction for the purpose of maintaining posture and balance. Now go down to the tectospinal tract. Tectospinal is referring to the tectum. The tectum is the roof of the midbrain. In the roof of the midbrain, we have the corpora quadrigemini. Those nuclei are involved in reflexive turning of the head. So since it's reflexive, it's not under voluntary control. So the tectospinal tract only runs from the tectum, the roof of the midbrain, to the muscles of the neck, because it's involved in turning the head away from things that appear to be coming at your face. If a baseball is flying at your face, you reflexively turn your head away. Or in the case of the inferior colliculi, a reflexive turning away from sounds. So if you're standing somewhere in a parking lot and somebody suddenly honks their horn, well, you jump and you turn your head away. That is a reflexive turning away from sounds. Okay, I think that covers both the sensory pathways shown here in green and the motor pathways shown in red. Okay, remember that we have 31 pairs of spinal nerves. The spinal nerves are formed by the coming together of the roots. The spinal nerves only run for about an inch, and then they bifurcate into a ventral ramus and a dorsal ramus. So what we're talking about here are plexi that form between the ventral rami of the spinal nerves. The dorsal rami only innervate the skin and muscles of the back. Well, the reason for that is because the vertebral column is at the back. There's nothing behind it but muscles and skin. So the dorsal rami are only concerned about innervating the muscles and skin behind the backbone. So what we're talking about here are the ventral rami, the ones that run toward the front of the body. Well, in the cervical area, the neck, we're talking about C1 to C5 to form the cervical plexus. Branches from the cervical plexus innervate structures in the back of the head, around the ears, in the neck, and in the upper shoulder area. So we have nerves like the great auricular, referring to around the ears, or the lesser occipital. Well, that's the back of the head. Also, coming from the cervical plexus, you should know the two phrenic nerves, which head south to innervate the diaphragm. Well, that's breathing. So those two nerves are branches of the cervical plexus, and the cervical plexus neighborhood is C1 to C5. Next is the brachial plexus. The brachial plexus, that means arm. So all of the branches of the brachial plexus are going to go to the left and right arms. So we have the radial nerve, the ulnar nerve, the musculocutaneous nerve, the axillary nerve. Those are branches of the brachial plexus, left and right. The brachial plexus comes from C5 to T2. South of that, we have the thoracic nerves. We don't form any plexi in the thoracic area. So the dorsal rami simply innervate the skin and musculature of the back. The ventral rami of the thoracic nerves, T1 to T12, those form the intercostal nerves. They run between the ribs and they wrap around to the front of the body, innervating the structures along the way. South of that, we have the lumbar plexus. The lumbar plexus originates at L1 and runs to L4. We have nerves that go to the lower abdominal region, down into the pelvic region, even down into the upper thigh that branch from the lumbar and large lumbar plexus. We then have the sacrococcygeal plexus, which runs from L5 to CO1. There are several nerves that originate from the sacrococcygeal plexus. Many of them innervate the legs. The sciatic nerve comes from there and branches into the tibial and fibular nerve, and also from the sacrococcygeal plexus, the innervation of the genitalia by way of the pudendal nerve. Okay, so we have these plexi of the ventral rami of the spinal nerves that you should be familiar with. So on the next slide, I have simply listed the branches from these various plexi.